There are moments in a reporter's life when you stop being a journalist and become simply a witness. When the notebook falls away, when the questions die on your lips, and all you can do is stand there and let the moment wash over you like a wave. I've had a few of those moments in my long career, but none, and I mean this with every fiber of my being, none affected me quite like the night I heard Aretha Franklin sing in an empty church in Detroit, her voice rising through the darkness like a prayer that didn't need an answer because it was the answer itself. People knew her voice from the radio, from the recordings that were already climbing the charts in 19. They knew Respect and Chain of Fools. They knew the power, the technique, the way she could bend a note until it carried the weight of centuries. But that night, in that small Baptist church on the east side of Detroit, with just me and her piano player and the ghost of her father's sermon still hanging in the air, I heard something different. I heard what it cost her. I heard where that voice came from. And I understood finally why they would one day call her the Queen of Soul. Not because she claimed the throne, but because the throne was the only place vast enough to hold what she carried inside her. I need to tell you about that night. Not because the world needs another story about Aretha Franklin's greatness, her music has already testified to that for all time, but because some truths are too sacred to die with the people who witnessed them. And this is one of those truths. It was late October of 1967, and Detroit was a city still smoldering from the riots that had torn through it that summer. I'd come to do a series of reports on urban America, on the fault lines that were splitting the nation apart, on the anger and hope that seemed to exist simultaneously in places like Detroit, Newark, and Watts. The civil rights movement had shifted, had grown more complex and more fractured. The questions were harder now. The answers were fewer. CBS had arranged for me to interview several prominent figures in the black community, and someone, I can't remember who now, suggested I speak with Reverend C.L. Franklin's daughter, the singer who was making waves with Atlantic Records. She's got something to say, my producer told me, and more importantly, she knows how to say it. I'd heard her music, of course. You couldn't turn on a radio in 1967 without hearing that voice, rich and deep and impossibly precise, with a rawness that made you feel like she was singing directly to your soul. But hearing someone on the radio and meeting them in person are two very different things, especially when that person is Aretha Franklin. We met at Columbia Records studio in Detroit on a Tuesday afternoon. The building was nondescript, industrial, the kind of place you'd walk past without a second glance. But inside, the walls seemed to vibrate with history, with all the music that had been born in those rooms. The receptionist directed me to Studio B, and I could hear the piano before I opened the door, a cascade of gospel chords that seemed to pour out like water from a well. She was sitting at the piano, her back to the door, her shoulders moving slightly with the music. She wore a simple dress, burgundy, I think, and her hair was styled in the way women wore it then, teased and perfect. But what struck me immediately wasn't her appearance. It was the way the room seemed to arrange itself around her, as if she were the sun and everything else was just orbiting at a respectful distance. "Miss Franklin," I said, and she turned. Those eyes, Lord, those eyes. Dark and intelligent and somehow both guarded and completely open at the same time. She looked at me the way I imagine a surgeon looks at a patient, assessing, measuring, deciding how much trust to extend. "Mr. Cronkite," she said, her speaking voice softer than I expected, with a slight rasp that suggested either exhaustion or emotion held barely in check. "They told me you wanted to talk about the music." "And about Detroit," I said, "about what's happening in this city, in this country." She nodded slowly, then gestured to a chair near the piano. "Sit down. You want to understand, you need to hear something first." She turned back to the piano, her fingers finding the keys like a bird finding its perch, and she began to play. Not one of her hits, not something I recognized. This was something older, something that sounded like it had been pulled up from the bedrock of American music, a spiritual maybe, or a hymn that had survived the Middle Passage and the cotton fields and the long, brutal march toward freedom that still wasn't finished. And then she sang. I'm not a music critic. I'm a newsman trained to observe and report, to keep emotional distance from my subjects. But when Aretha Franklin's voice filled that studio, all of my professional detachment evaporated like morning dew. The sound was enormous, not in volume but in presence. It seemed to fill every corner of the room, every space between the molecules of air. It was a sound that made you believe in the divine, that made you understand why people built cathedrals and wrote psalms and fell to their knees in the presence of something greater than themselves. She sang for maybe 3 minutes, though time felt suspended, irrelevant. When she finished, her hands remained on the keys, and the silence that followed was as profound as the music had been. That's where it starts, she said quietly, not looking at me. Everything I do, everything I sing, it starts there, in the church, with my Father's voice calling down heaven, with my mother's hands on my shoulders, with the knowledge that music isn't entertainment, it's survival. It's the way we told ourselves we were still human when the world tried to convince us otherwise. Over the next few hours, we talked, or rather, she talked, and I listened, my notebook gradually forgotten in my lap. She told me about growing up in her father's church, about being pushed onto the stage before she could even read music, about the terror and exhilaration of having this enormous gift inside her and not knowing what to do with it. People think it's easy, she said at one point, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. They think you're born with a voice like this and everything just happens. But they don't see the work. They don't see the fear. Every time I step up to a microphone, there's a part of me that wonders if this will be the time it doesn't come, if this will be the time I open my mouth and nothing happens. Does that fear ever go away, I asked. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, it just becomes part of the process. You learn to sing through it, over it, with it. You learn that the fear and the power come from the same place, and you can't have one without the other. As evening approached, she suggested we continue our conversation somewhere else. There's a place I need to go, she said, a church on the east side. I try to go there when I'm home, when the noise gets too loud. You want to really understand? Come with me. I followed her car through Detroit's darkening streets. The city looked different at dusk, softer, more vulnerable. Lights were coming on in windows. People were heading home from work, and there was a quality to the air that felt heavy with history and hope and heartbreak all mixed together. The church was small, wedged between a barber shop and a vacant lot where weeds grew through cracked concrete. New Bethel Baptist, though I later learned it wasn't her father's famous church, this was somewhere else, somewhere more private. She had a key, which surprised me until she explained that the pastor was an old family friend who let her use the space when she needed to think, to pray, to sing without anyone listening. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and candle wax and something else, something that might have been faith. If faith had a smell, the pews were worn smooth by generations of bodies. The hymnals were dog-eared and marked with penciled notes, and at the front, on a small raised platform, sat an upright piano that looked like it had survived the Great Flood. This is where I come, Aretha said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space, when I need to remember why I do this. When the record executives start talking about demographics and radio play and crossover appeal, when the producers want me to sing it this way or that way, when everybody has an opinion about what Aretha Franklin should sound like, I come here and I sing for the only audience that matters. God, I asked. She smiled. Myself, the little girl who used to sing in her daddy's church and didn't care about anything except getting it right, making it beautiful, offering it up as a gift. Before it became a career, before it became political, before it became anything except pure joy. There was a young man sitting in the back pew. I hadn't noticed him before. Aretha introduced him as Marcus, her piano player. A thin man with gentle eyes who nodded at me but said nothing. He moved to the piano with the ease of long familiarity and sat down, his fingers hovering over the keys, waiting. What do you want to hear? Aretha asked me. Whatever you need to sing, I said. She closed her eyes for a moment, and I saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. Then she nodded to Marcus, and he began to play, a slow, mournful progression that sounded like grief itself given musical form. When Aretha began to sing, I understood immediately that this was different from what I'd heard in the studio. This wasn't a performance. This was confession, exorcism, transformation. She sang a spiritual I didn't recognize, something about troubled water and weary souls and the long road home. Her voice started soft, almost conversational, as if she were telling a story to a close friend. But with each verse it grew, not louder necessarily, but deeper, richer, more textured with emotion. I watched her face as she sang, and I saw something extraordinary happening. The guardedness in her eyes dissolved. The careful control she maintained in public fell away. She was 25 years old in that moment, but her voice carried the weight of centuries. All the pain and resilience and stubborn hope of a people who had endured the unendurable and somehow still found reasons to sing. Her hands moved as she sang, not wildly, but with purpose, punctuating phrases, reaching for invisible things, pushing away invisible burdens. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, not from heat, but from effort, from the sheer physical and emotional exertion of pulling this music up from whatever deep place it lived inside her. And then, in the middle of the third verse, her voice cracked. Not a mistake, not a technical failure, but a deliberate breaking that made the song more real, more true. It is the sound of vulnerability, of humanity, of a woman who carried the hopes of millions, but was still just a woman, still just someone who hurt and feared and doubted. The tears came then, silent, streaming down her face, but she didn't stop singing. If anything, she sang harder. her voice pushing through the emotion like a swimmer fighting a current. Marcus kept playing, his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly with the music, and I sat frozen in that pew, feeling like I was witnessing something sacred, something that should have required permission to observe. When she finished, the last note hung in the air for what seemed like forever before, finally fading into silence. Aretha stood there, breathing hard, her face wet with tears, her hands trembling at her sides. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her with such profound respect that I felt like an intruder, like I'd stumbled into a private ceremony. "I'm sorry," she said finally, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," I said, my own voice rougher than I expected. "Don't ever apologize for that." She sat down heavily in the front pew, and I moved to sit beside her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The church held us in its silence, and somehow that silence felt more eloquent than any words we might have found. "They want me to be strong," she said eventually. "The movement needs me to be strong. My people need me to be strong. Every time I sing respect, I'm supposed to be making a statement, claiming space, demanding dignity. And I am. I do. But nobody talks about how exhausting it is to be a symbol, how lonely it is to carry everyone's hopes on your shoulders when you're just trying to figure out your own life." She turned to look at me, and in the dim light of the church, I could see the exhaustion etched into her young face. "I'm 25 years old, Mr. Cronkite. I've been singing professionally since I was 14. I've been a mother since I was 13. I've seen things and experienced things that should have broken me. And somehow, I'm supposed to stand on stage every night and be the voice of a generation, the sound of freedom, the embodiment of black pride and female empowerment, and every other thing people need me to be. And I want to be those things. God knows I want to be worthy of what people see in me. But sometimes," she trailed off, looking down at her hands, "sometimes I just want to be Aretha, the girl who loves to sing and doesn't always know what to do with this gift she's been given." I thought carefully about what to say. This wasn't an interview anymore, if it ever had been. This was a moment of profound trust, and I felt the weight of that responsibility. "I think," I said slowly, "that the reason your voice moves people the way it does isn't because you're a symbol or a statement. It's because when you sing, people hear truth. They hear someone who's lived, who's suffered, who's fought, who's loved, who's lost. They hear humanity in its most distilled form. And that's not something you can fake or manufacture. That's something you earn." Aretha was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "My father used to say that the voice is the soul made audible, that when you sing, you're revealing who you really are, all the broken pieces and the beautiful pieces together. He said the best singers are the ones brave enough to let people hear all of it. Your father is a wise man. He's also a complicated man," she said with a slight smile. "Like all of us, I suppose." We sat there for another hour, talking about music and Detroit and America and the strange burden of being young and gifted and black and 19. She told me about her children, about the relationships that had shaped her, about the dreams she still carried, and the fears that kept her awake at night. She was remarkably honest, remarkably vulnerable, and I found myself forgetting that I was talking to Aretha Franklin, the rising star. I was just talking to Aretha, a young woman trying to navigate an impossible moment in history while carrying an impossible gift. When we finally left the church, the night had grown cold. Detroit stretched out around us, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance I could hear music, a radio playing maybe, or someone singing in an apartment. The city felt alive, resilient, scarred but not broken. "Thank you," Aretha said as we reached our cars, "for listening, for not trying to turn me into something I'm not." "Thank you," I replied, "for trusting me with this." She smiled then, a real smile, warm and genuine. "You know what the beautiful thing about music is, Mr. Cronkite? It doesn't lie. When I'm on that stage, when I'm singing, I can't hide. Every emotion, every truth, every piece of my soul is right there in the sound. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. And maybe that's what people respond to. Maybe they hear someone who's as scared and confused and hopeful as they are, but who's willing to stand up and sing about it anyway." I've thought about that night countless times over the years. I covered Aretha's career as it unfolded, watched her become exactly what people predicted she would become, a legend, an icon, the Queen of Soul. I saw her at inaugurations and award ceremonies, heard her voice ring out at historic moments and intimate gatherings. Each time I remembered that empty church, remembered the way she sang when there was no audience except herself and whatever divine presence she was calling down. In 2018, when news of her passing reached me, I was in my study, surrounded by the souvenirs of a long career, photographs and awards and memories made tangible. I turned on the radio and heard her voice, still powerful, still capable of moving me to tears. And I thought about what she'd told me that night in Detroit, about music being the soul made audible, about the courage it takes to reveal yourself completely. Aretha Franklin gave the world many gifts. She gave us Respect and Amazing Grace and Natural Woman and dozens of other songs that became the soundtrack of our lives. She gave us a voice for the civil rights movement, for the women's movement, for every movement that demanded dignity and justice. She gave us excellence so profound that it redefined what excellence meant. But what she gave me that night in that small church was something more personal and perhaps more precious. She gave me a glimpse of the human being behind the phenomenon, the young woman who carried an enormous burden with grace and doubt and courage, all mixed together. She let me see the cost of greatness, the price of being extraordinary in a world that often mistakes confidence for arrogance and vulnerability for weakness. I'm an old man now, and I've seen many things in my years on this earth. I've watched history unfold, witnessed moments that changed the world. But I'll tell you this, I never heard anything quite like Aretha Franklin's voice that night in Detroit, singing to an empty church, tears streaming down her face, every note a small act of redemption. That voice wasn't performing. That voice wasn't trying to be anything except what it was, human and divine, broken and whole, a sound so beautiful and so true that it seemed to contain all of America's pain and promise in a single breath. She changed music. She changed culture. She changed the way we think about artistry and dignity and the power of the human voice. But more than that, she changed the very soul of America with every note she sang, not because she was trying to change it, but because she was brave enough to show us her own soul first, with all its cracks and its radiance shining through. And that, I believe, is what true greatness looks like. That's what I'll remember when I think of Aretha Franklin. Not just the Queen of Soul, but the young woman who taught me that the most powerful music comes from the willingness to be completely, vulnerably, courageously human. That's the way it was, and that's the way I'll carry it with me always.